welcome everybody to Tokens of Wisdom. By now, you've certainly all heard about the latest SEC release on the application of federal securities laws to certain crypto assets and related transactions. Now, there are countless law firm memos, summaries, analyses, and hot takes, both boring and bold, out there, and so if you want a detailed summary of the release and everything in it, this is not the episode for you. What I want to cover today is, what does this release actually mean for you? And by you, I mean the target audience of this show, fund managers, especially fund managers that invest in crypto assets. As you probably know by now, I've been advising those managers for at least a decade now, and persistent regulatory uncertainty has been stalking them that entire time like Kathy Bates in Misery. If you read the aforementioned hot takes, you'll no doubt be told that the stalker has been caught red-handed and is being locked away for life. Regulatory uncertainty is over. Well, as I've said before on this show, not to be the bearer of bad news, but my take is, not quite. It's more like the cops have publicly identified the suspect. We all know now that Kathy is the stalker, and so she's gone into hiding to evade capture. But it's still possible to envision a new sheriff taking office, changing enforcement priorities and interpretations, and that allowing the stalker back out of the shadows. Okay, I may have stretched that analogy too far. What I'm trying to convey is that this new release is hugely significant. It's the most concrete and actionable guidance the SEC has ever released about how it situates crypto assets in the context of federal securities laws. It's great news for the industry, but it is just an interpretive release. It's not a formal rule. It's certainly not legislation. Do recall the 3 rungs of the regulatory ladder. We're still trying to get from rung 1 up to that second rung. We haven't ascended further than that. The release describes itself as an interpretive rule and thus exempt from the Administrative Procedure Act's notice and comment requirements. That's all well and good, but it also means that the next SEC could come in and undo this, also without having to go through the notice and comment period. As such, without more concrete action, a new SEC could take charge in 2029 and bring back the aggressive interpretations and regulation by enforcement approach we came to know and revile under Chair Gary Gensler. Now, while I told you I wasn't going to summarize the release, and I'm not, I swear, I do need to talk about it a little to situate the analysis that follows for you fund managers. So, here goes. The release starts by defining what a security is. For veteran listeners of this show, this is old hat. See episode 4. The release then identifies 5 broad categories of crypto assets: digital commodities, digital collectibles, digital tools, stable coins, and digital securities. It defines each category and gives specific examples of assets that fit into each one. To me, the analysis around digital commodities is the most interesting. Digital commodities are assets that lack any intrinsic economic properties or rights, but that are necessary to participate in or use certain aspects of an associated functional crypto system. A system is functional if its native asset can be used on the system in accordance with its programmatic utility of the system. It then assumes that assets that fit that bill, assets native to a functional blockchain system, derive value from the programmatic operation of that system and market forces, i.e., supply and demand. The assumption is that supply and demand are driving appreciation, not the elusive efforts of others, which we'll talk about in a minute. The release clarifies that the first 3 categories of assets I just described, digital commodities, digital collectibles, and digital tools, are not, by themselves, securities. It states that even though these assets are not, by themselves, securities, they can, like any other asset, whether a share of stock or a contract to manage a grove of orange trees, they can be offered and sold in a transaction that counts as an investment contract and is thus a security. This is not surprising. This is consistent with everything I've been telling you since the dawn of time. Note that the Gensler SEC thought this also, but that's where the similarities start to end and where divergences begin to appear. Recall that under the Gensler SEC, they basically thought every digital asset met the Howey Test. If you don't believe me, just go back and read the complaints against Coinbase and Binance for a breakdown of the SEC's analysis there. Helpfully, your favorite podcast host summarized both actions in episode 16. Also recall that the Howey Test has 3 elements. Number 1, an investment of money. Number 2, in a common enterprise. Number 3, with the expectation of profits derived from the efforts of others. The huge difference here is in the application of that last prong. The expectation of profits derived from the efforts of others. And the real difference in approach from Gensler to Atkins relates to a word that does not even appear in the original Howey court case. Reasonable. You'll notice that I didn't use that word when citing the Howey test. The third prong in Howey does not explicitly require a purchaser's expectation of profits derived from the efforts of others to be reasonable. But over the years, as courts and regulators applied the Howey test, IRL, it became clear that they would do so using objective criteria. The question they consider is this: would a reasonable person expect profits to be derived from the efforts of others? And thus, an objective reasonability requirement was read into that third Howey prong. Now, note that this is not controversial. Go ahead, read that SEC complaint against Coinbase, and you'll see them refer to Howey's third prong as being, quote, the reasonable expectation of profits derived from the efforts of others, unquote. So the Gensler SEC agrees with the Atkins SEC that a purchaser's expectation of profits needs to be reasonable in order to satisfy the Howey's third prong. The Gensler SEC just didn't spill a lot of ink in determining whether a perceived expectation of profits was or was not reasonable. And it's clear from this release that the Atkins SEC is very much concerned with the reasonability of that expectation. Whereas under Chair Gensler, just about any activity by a centralized party, communicated in any way and at any time, was enough to satisfy this third prong, the current SEC views reasonability as a real limiting factor. For digital commodities, which require a functional decentralized blockchain, there is an implicit assumption that the value will rise or fall based on market forces, based on supply and demand. Thus, for a purchaser to reasonably expect that their profits would derive instead from the efforts of others, it takes a bunch of extra stuff. Number 1, the issuer itself, or someone colluding with the issuer, needs to make explicit representations or promises. It would be unreasonable for a purchaser to rely on promises made by some random third party or some other holder of the coin because those people simply can't bind the issuer. Number 2, those reps or promises need to involve essential managerial efforts that affect the failure or success of the enterprise. Activities that are merely administrative or ministerial do not satisfy Howey's third prong. And this SEC gives some examples of administrative or ministerial activities in connection with a functioning blockchain that include things like protocol mining, protocol staking, wrapping, marketing-related endeavors designed to help grow the ecosystem, etc. No reasonable person, the SEC reasons, would think they were going to make big bucks because someone promised to handle the administrative tasks associated with an investment. Number 3, the promises have to be specific and detailed. Vague or generic promotional statements that lack milestones, funding, or other plans for needed resources probably don't create reasonable expectations of profits. In other words, if I say to you, hey, I'm a marketing genius, so hodl my coin, it's a rocket ship going past the moon all the way to Mars, that would not reasonably instill in you an expectation that my efforts were going to result in your profits. What reasonable person would believe my marketing acumen would generate profits for them based exclusively on that statement? I clearly don't sound like a serious person, and if you believe me, you are not acting reasonably. Number 4, the promises also have to be made prior to or contemporaneously with the sale at question. Obviously, if I make a promise to you 10 minutes after you buy my coin, you did not rely on that promise when making your purchase decision. Similarly, if I made some vague promise years before you purchased your coin, it may or may not be reasonable to continue relying on that promise. Depends on what's happened in the interim. And it's this in-depth discussion and analysis of reasonability that is the difference between an SEC that thinks every crypto asset is a security and an SEC that doesn't. What I think is most instructive here is to look at a couple specific examples. In the release last week, the SEC cited SOL and ADA as 2 examples of digital commodities that are not securities. Instructively, in its complaint against Coinbase 3 years ago, the SEC explicitly named SOL and ADA as two crypto asset securities, allegedly sold illegally in unregistered securities offerings on Coinbase's platform. What changed in the intervening 3 years? Well, haven't you been listening? Literally everything. Most specifically, the reasonability requirement. The Gensler SEC and the Atkins SEC agree that SOL is the native token of the Solana blockchain, and that ADA is the native token of the Cardano blockchain. To the Atkins SEC, this means that they are digital commodities whose value is assumed to be based on market forces. Thus, if they're going to be sold in an investment contract where a buyer reasonably expects profits to be derived from the efforts of others, not from the forces of supply and demand, then the issuer itself would need to make specific promises to buyers to engage in essential managerial efforts that will drive that value. To the Gensler SEC, both SOL and ADA were founded by someone. Those someones designed the blockchains and, to varying degrees, disseminated promotional and other marketing materials promoting those chains and trying to grow their respective networks. That those parties existed and at some point disseminated information suggesting they would do something means that henceforth all buyers of SOL and ADA reasonably expected their profits would derive from those efforts. There is no distinction under the Gensler SEC between essential managerial efforts and activities that are merely administrative or ministerial. There is no requirement under the Gensler SEC that promises be detailed and specific. There is no concept of separation, according to the Gensler SEC, where the efforts of others would be deemed achieved or abandoned at a certain point. To the Gensler view of things, that some central party once existed and spread promotional material into the public realm at any point in time is enough for all subsequent purchasers to reasonably expect profits derived from those others' efforts. Now, on balance, of course, I think the Atkins formulation makes more sense. When I buy SOL today, I'm expecting profit only because I think the blockchain works and serves a compelling purpose and will thus grow, leading demand for SOL to grow and the value of my SOL token to increase. I am not buying it because back in 2021, Solana Labs said it would work to grow the Solana network by releasing more podcasts or creating more YouTube content. Be honest with yourself. Neither are you. Okay, so I know I said I wasn't going to summarize like twice, and then I went and I summarized anyway. I just couldn't help myself. I am, after all, a lawyer who does a podcast about law stuff, and so I am at heart a nerd, and thank you for indulging my nerdiness. What does this actually mean for you, dear fund manager investing in crypto assets? Well, I am so glad that you asked. To date, my advice to managers has been that you should assume these assets are or might be securities. If you manage a fund investing in digital assets, you are an investment advisor because these assets are or might be securities. Now, some people are inevitably going to read this release and come to a different conclusion. They're going to say that digital asset fund managers are not investment advisors as long as they only invest in assets this release would categorize outside the definition of a security. Now, undoubtedly, there are some managers and some strategies for whom this can probably work. But I think it's probably a mistake for most, and here's why. To be comfortable in that position, you'll need to undertake extensive due diligence on every asset your fund might acquire. First, you're going to need to review and make sure that it falls within one of the first three categories. It's either a digital commodity, a digital collectible, or a digital tool. Then you'll need to confirm that its issuer, founder, centralized party didn't make the kind of reps in connection with its sale to initial purchasers that might land it in the investment contract territory. Again, if this asset was initially sold combined with a promise from the issuer that it was going to undertake some essential managerial efforts from which you might derive profits, then it was probably at least at one point subject to an investment contract and thus a security. If it was, or even if it's borderline, you would then have to analyze whether separation has occurred. Have the promises made been achieved or abandoned? If yes, then maybe you can feel comfortable that it's still outside the security definition. Then you'll have to document this analysis and keep it in your records. And again, you're going to have to do this for every asset you might acquire. That process might be time-consuming and expensive for one asset, but the more frequently you trade and the wider your universe of assets, the more intense that analysis becomes. And so for a lot of strategies, for a lot of managers, it's just not going to be practical to do that level of analysis on every asset. Also, it's super subjective. If you didn't get that from my explanation, it's fair to assume that the current SEC is not going to aggressively claim jurisdiction over borderline assets, but it's really not that hard to stretch the imagination forward to 2029. Imagine a different chair in charge of the SEC, and imagine them returning to a more enforcement-forward posture. To that point, like I said above, this is just interpretive guidance. It is an indication of how the SEC currently interprets the Howey Test in connection with digital assets. It's not binding on a court. It's not even legally binding on the SEC. The next SEC could change it very easily with a snap of a finger, not even having to go through the notice and comment period. To me, for most managers, the prudent, simpler, and more certain path will be to continue assuming these assets are or might be securities and comporting yourself accordingly. And finally, one note of caution, don't forget the CFTC. If these assets aren't securities, many of them are still commodities. And if you're trading any derivatives based on these assets, you probably meet the definition of a CPO or CTA and need to either register as such or claim an exemption from registration. Okay, with that scintillating conversation out of the way, we can get to the part you've all been waiting for. The legal disclaimer. On this show, my guests and I discuss laws, regulations, and aspects of fund management from a 10,000-foot view. And nothing I say here, nothing my guests say here is legal, investment, or tax advice. Everything we say is our own personal opinion. Nobody is speaking on behalf of their employers on this show, and it is entirely for educational purposes only. If you're thinking about starting a fund or you're curious about what's involved, this show is a good resource as you explore your options. But if you're going to pull the trigger and actually launch a fund, please engage professional service providers to assist you in the process.